So hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation entitled Moving Beyond the Dweller into the Light of the Aquarian Dawn. Before we get started, I'd like to bring our attention to the fact that we are on the eve of the first Wesak festival after the 2025 conclave, a time marked by DK as the beginning of a new phase of spiritual unfoldment. And we'll get into just what this new phase is as my talk unfolds. But first, we might ask just what happened during the conclave. All we know, based on DK's writings, is that the masters of wisdom will have now evaluated the state of the human heart and mind in order to determine the timing and the best method for their physical plane approach. Not whether or not they will approach. The groundwork has already been laid for that. But rather the most effective methods for their approach. From our perspective, one of the most important variables is how long the new group of world servers will need to prepare the way for the descent of the great ones. DK tells us that during the early stages, preparing for the appearance of the more senior members of the ashrams will be quite arduous and difficult, and that the great task of slowly and laboriously instilling those new ideas that will govern the Aquarian age will be on the shoulders of the world disciples, which DK predicted now number in the millions. Their work will be to introduce better methods of human relations, hold before the eyes of distraught humanity the new vision of hope and of spiritual enlightenment, offset the quote-unquote scheming of reactionary and conservative politicians and churchmen, that's a direct quote, and teach the youth of the coming age new models of living, indicating to them better values, and thus through all these activities, gradually bring into being a new world order, a world order that will be necessary for the great ones to be able to integrate, vibrationally integrate as they descend. DK lists 5 ashrams that will be especially involved in this first wave of the externalization. These include the ashrams of the Master Kuthumi, whose efforts will be largely directed towards the general public, working primarily through educators in all countries. The Master Morya, which will be focused on instilling more enlightened governmental structure, being a first-rate master, and our beloved Master Jwal Kul, who will act as a liaison officer, he tells us, between those active and conscious disciples who are working in the world of outer affairs and those directly responsible to the Christ for the desired work of preparation. One of the most important passages for understanding how and by who the first wave of the externalization will take place comes to us from externalization of the hierarchy. So see if you recognize yourself in this as I read this passage. The disciples sent out from the various ashrams do not arrive on earth conscious of a high mission or knowing well the nature of the task to which they have been subjectively assigned. In the case of certain disciples who will be of special world prominence and who are of initiate rank, they may attain to a conviction of mission, if I may call it so, in their extreme youth, and thus be oriented toward their life task from the very start. That conviction will grow and deepen and clarify as the years go by. But it must be remembered that the majority of disciples will not so react. They will come into incarnation with certain gifts and innate talents, and with certain firmly rooted ideas, endowed with irrevocable ideals, and a brain which is responsive to a well-developed mind. They will, normally and through natural trends and predilections, find their way into that field of human activity wherein they are intended to work, and in which they are to bring about certain basic changes in line with hierarchical intent. This hierarchical intent will usually be unknown to them, though this may not always be the case. But the work to be done will seem to them impelling and necessary, and something which they must do at all costs. They will find their way into politics, into the educational movements, and into science, and they will work as humanitarians, as social workers, and in the field of finance. One of the most important tasks for this initial wave of disciples will be to recondition the lower mental plane by seeding it with thought forms of selflessness and service. This will establish the necessary foundation for the second wave of the externalization, a descent from the Buddhic to the astral plane, specifically intended to dissipate what DK calls the planetary fog through an infusion of the quality of aspiration. This redemptive labor, overseen by a specialized group of adepts and masters, will anchor the transformative light of the second ray onto the astral plane. At a much later date, the hierarchy will initiate a descent into the physical etheric subplane. At this point, certain members of the Great White Lodge will direct operations from this physical etheric level, while others will take full physical incarnation. The descent by the Masters and later by the Christ into the etheric subplanes will act as a profound stimulant, accelerating the awakening of humanity's etheric bodies, their vehicles, as well as of etheric vision, which will be a key development for the recognition by humanity of the newly externalized hierarchy. Just visualize that for a moment. In fact, the Tibetan tells us that the full externalization of the ashrams and the objective visibility of the masters will be the defining hallmark of the coming age. The year 2117 was given by DK as the beginning of the age, but the actual timing of the outer manifestation of the masters will be dependent on how effectively the work of the first wave will be integrated by humanity. And from that quote that I just read, if you recognize yourself in that quote, these aren't beings who have, come in knowing exactly what they're going to do, still having a connection with a hierarchy. In fact, it's just the opposite of that. You're just drawn through your life path into the work of preparation, right? DK tells us, quote, one event is already in process of manifesting. The Christ and his disciples, the masters of wisdom and the great companions, are approaching nearer to the physical plane. The work of mental preparation for that event and the construction of the thought form of the advent of the second coming has now been completed. There remains the precipitation of that event, its appearance on astral levels, and its materialization on the physical plane, suggesting that the mental plane has already been conditioned by the great ones for the disciples and lesser initiates of the first wave, who will be working with mental matter to prepare humanity for the externalization. Actually, the initial preparatory phase, called the Age of the Forerunner, which took place between 1925 and the 2025 conclaves, and which was in large part oriented towards education, started with what DK calls the externalization impulse in 1875. In Externalization of the Hierarchy, he states, HPB, one of the first working disciples to go forth on the externalization impulse, and with first ray energy driving him, notice the pronoun, gave the background of the plan under impression from me, the more detailed structures, and the sweep of the hierarchical intention have been given by me in books which AAB has introduced under her own name to the public. We can only guess who else may have appeared under this initial externalization impulse. In the West, I would include Krishnamurti. This is certainly a partial list. Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater. In the East, the Indian masters, Ramakrishna, Aurobindo, Yogananda, and Neem Karoli Baba, who through their disciples helped bring the ageless wisdom to the West. On the inner side, certain masters have been working to prepare the way for their own externalization. Quote, the Master Morya, the Master Kuthumi, and the Master Jesus are the three working at this time in closest cooperation with the Christ. With them worked the Master Hilarion, he whom you call the Master DK, and another master who is especially linked with the work of preparation in the sacred land of India. One of the English masters is also exceptionally active, and the master in America is laying his plans towards an active participation in the work. These consecrated workers form a nucleus around the Christ and direct much of the preparatory work. These masters are definitely preparing themselves for the task of outer activity and are intensifying their work on the astral plane. To this fact can be traced the interest people are now showing in occultism and in the work of the masters. More and more people are becoming sensitive to and conscious of their presence, and more are finding their way into the groups of disciples. The pages that follow this passage give a detailed description of the preparatory work of each of these masters. It's a great read if you want to go deeper into this subject. All this activity is part of the process of anchoring the planetary Antakarana in the human kingdom. The new phase of the externalization, which begins now, might be described as the electrification of this Antakarana. To this end, the incoming seventh ray of ceremonial order will increasingly provide the conductive energy necessary for the will and purpose of Sanat Kumara to flow down the planetary Antakarana through the heart of the hierarchy and into humanity, the throat center of the Logos, with the long-term goal being to create a frictionless planetary circuit where the will of God progresses unimpeded from Shambhala into the elemental substance of the earth itself. DK tells us that it was activation of a direct link between Shambhala and humanity that compelled the forces of evil to arise during the World War. Quote, "This was the deeply esoteric and unrecognized cause of the war, the beneficent bringing to an end of the impediments to the free flow of spiritual energy down into the third center. This was the factor which called evil from its hidden place and brought the opposing forces to the surface of existence prior to their sealing. Since their defeat, these forces have regrouped, as we all know, in new forms, but with the same goal, to delay the externalization. I say delay, not stop, because the externalization cannot and will not be stopped by the dark forces. The human kingdom, whose destiny is to anchor the planetary Antakarana, now stands at the threshold of the first initiation. This transition into initiate status, which is being accelerated by the high voltage energy of the first ray, directed toward the human center via the avatar of synthesis, is what is forcing the ancient crystallized thought forms, the deep-seated pride, greed, and separateness that defined the materialistic conditioning of the Piscean age, into the light in order to finally be confronted and transformed. So, the current outbreaks of war, predatory business practices, and geopolitical polarization are not signs of a new darkness. Rather, they represent our ancient shadow, but now seen in a new light as something no longer in keeping with the current Aquarian influenced values of human dignity, fair play, and goodwill. As the pressure of externalization builds, people have begun to sense the collapse of the old world order. Influenced by the fading shadow of the sixth ray, some react with fear and national isolationism, hoping to return to a fictional past. This creates a cloud of inchoate, emotionally charged thought forms, which has to be dissipated before the externalized ashrams can safely anchor their operations in our major cities. So at this point, we might ask, why doesn't the hierarchy simply intervene? If the ashrams are going to externalize anyway, why don't the masters of wisdom utilize their abilities as white magicians to bind the dweller, thereby forcing an end to war and suffering? Well, the obvious answer, which we all know, is that it would violate human free will, which the hierarchy is pledged not to do. But there's a subtler reason hinted at in a passage from Robert Browning's poem, Old Pictures in Florence. He wrote that the soul learns by the means of evil that good is best. We must ourselves choose good as a result of our abundant experience with personality darkness. Otherwise, individually and as a race, elements of our unresolved personality dweller would resurface in defiance. So seen in this light, the crisis we face are the catalyst. The quote-unquote evil we see manifesting in our institutions, the wars, corruption, the oligarchy, the cruelty, must become so undeniably acute, so intolerable, that humanity, of its own free will choose a better way forward. We must see the dweller and choose to no longer be the dweller. Addressing this point, DK tells us that the Christ is in process of merging his expression with the will to synthesis by means of a dynamic stimulation from the avatar of synthesis. This great being is, quote, coming to earth in order to further the manifestation of unity, of oneness, and of interrelation. And he comes, therefore, to wield and apply first-ray energy. He will charge or galvanize the three groups, the directing agents in Shambhala, the Nirmanakayas, and the new group of world servers, with dynamic energy, and in a mysterious way relate them to each other so that a new synthesis and alignment will be present upon the earth. Before, however, integration and synthesis are possible, this first-ray energy must work to destroy all that prevents integration and all that is hindering the needed synthesis. DK gives us a concise description of what the new group of world servers must accomplish once the old forms begin to disintegrate. First, they must teach the law of evolution and the fact that evolution leads us to the kingdom of souls. Second, that the great ones who have freed themselves from the three worlds of human endeavor exist entirely to serve their fellow men. The public, DK continues, must know their names and attributes, their work and purpose, and be told that they are coming forth for the salvation of the world. Thirdly, those who incarnate as the vanguard of the externalization must live harmoniously and love. The violent vibrations of our surroundings can only be stilled, we're told, by a strong counter vibration of love, which carries with it the power of the Godhead itself. It is only the sustained pressure of love that can eventually break down the walls of separativeness. Fourthly, DK says, quote, the living organism of aspirants and disciples can provide a center of peace, power, and love, of practical help and spiritual uplift, such as the world has not hitherto seen. Such is the hope. See you do it. And finally, church members and members of the Masonic fraternities must familiarize themselves with the inner significance of the various rites, ceremonies, colors, and rituals, and with the work performed upon the floor of the temple. All these activities will characterize the work done by disciples that make up the first wave of the externalization of the hierarchy. During the second wave, when the masters externalize, they will occupy key executive positions in all areas of human life. A master of the wisdom may appear as a brilliant statesman guiding international government. a revolutionary social scientist, a pioneering physician, or an artist who channels the energies of the Buddhic plane into physical form. They will be recognized by the public for their competence, inclusiveness, and selflessness. But the underlying purpose of this second wave is to prepare the way for the Christ. For he, as the avatar of the Aquarian age, cannot step onto the world stage as long as Piscean enmity and separativeness dominate. For the etheric shockwave of his presence, carrying the combined voltage of the second ray of love wisdom and the first ray of the avatar of synthesis, will require a highly conductive and stable planetary environment. And when the combined energies of the Christ and the avatar of synthesis engage with the human center, they will not be lowering their frequency to accommodate humanity's currently largely astral polarization, but instead will function as a dynamic vibratory stimulant that will irradiate the etheric body of the human kingdom, thereby raising the vibrational frequency of humanity's collective consciousness. As a result, the ancient crystallized thought forms that make up the planetary dweller, or what remains of them, will dissipate, liberating humanity to serve as a clear conduit for the incoming Aquarian light. So, the first wave builds the forms. The second wave, led by the masters, will step into these forms and raise humanity's collective vibration. Only then, when the planetary crucible has been prepared and the structural integrity of the new civilization is secure, will the world teacher externalize to physically anchor the new Aquarian consciousness on Earth. Okay. The hierarchy has established 5 focal points that will serve as receptors for the directed energies of the 5 ashrams that will be involved in the initial stages of the externalization. 3 of these are already active. 2 will come into activity as the new age unfolds. These planetary centers, which together form a 5-pointed star, thank you very much, Philip Lindsay, for this terrific illustration, are New York, London, Geneva, Darjeeling, and Tokyo. Through the Geneva Center, the 7th ray will anchor rhythmic order in the human kingdom, with the goal of grounding ideals of goodwill into effective international relations. In London, the 3rd, 5th, and 7th rays will be used to transmute materialism, direct global labor movements, and make worldwide economic adjustments. In New York, the 2nd ray is already in process of creating a vortex for global synthesis, disseminating the new esoteric teachings and right human relations. In Darjeeling, the 1st ray energy of the Himalayan Brotherhood, mostly quiescent at this time, will increasingly step down the will of Shambhala to create a synthesized global movement government. And finally, in Tokyo, almost entirely quiescent at this time, the magnetic atmosphere will be prepared to anchor Eastern and Western spiritual synthesis. From these 5 points, subsidiary ashrams will emerge, founded by senior disciples carrying out the initial work of preparing human minds to recognize the new Aquarian values and energies. Of these centers, New York, London are the most active. and with Geneva coming into greater activity as the Aquarian seventh ray begins to take hold. But we might ask, where is the actual evidence of this hierarchically inspired activity? After all, the brutal war in Ukraine continues to destabilize Europe and strain international alliances, while the escalating confrontations between Israel, Iran, and the United States threaten to ignite a broader regional conflagration in the Middle East. This violence is mirrored by a growing political polarization as a significant global shift toward right-leaning, isolationist populism challenges established democratic norms and international cooperation. Overshadowing these human conflicts is the existential threat of a warming planet, with climate-driven disasters becoming more frequent and severe, and the chilling resurgence of nuclear rhetoric, which has pushed the doomsday clock closer to midnight than at any point since the height of the Cold War. From all this, one might conclude that humanity has failed to establish the necessary prerequisites for the externalization of the hierarchy, and thus the planetary dweller has effectively blocked the path toward a more enlightened era. However, when viewed from an esoteric perspective, we see that these worrying developments are actually symptoms of a transition from a last-ditch resurgence of the shadow side of the waning Piscean age. The crystallized thought forms of nationalism and separatism are generating intense global friction, reacting violently to the inescapable pressure of the externalization process. But beneath this chaotic surface, there is a mammoth, though much quieter, counter movement transforming our planet. While it usually isn't mentioned in the breaking news, this surge of Aquarian energy is grounding itself through millions of organized collective activities. For example, there are over 10 million registered non-governmental and charitable organizations worldwide. It would take over 33,000 pages like this one to list them all. Involved in everything from habitat restoration and oceanic conservation to disease eradication, disaster response, and the protection of civil liberties. Certain of these organizations address restoration of the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms through reforestation and biodiversity initiatives, while others facilitate cross-border medical aid, basic human rights, poverty alleviation, and educational access for the human family. Collectively, they function as a service-oriented global infrastructure that operates independently of national borders. Also, a number of intergovernmental organizations like the European Union and the African Union have moved beyond simple trade agreements to establish shared legal, environmental, and security frameworks. In the Asia-Pacific region, the implementation of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, has created an affiliated economic zone representing nearly 1/3 of the global economy. This trend is mirrored in the environmental sectors, where a record number of multilateral treaties, including the recent High Seas Treaty, have legally bound member nations to a stewardship of global resources. Social movements representing the Aquarian values of group cooperation have grown exponentially since Alice Bailey's time. The model of social organization established by the civil rights, hippie, and feminist movements of the 60s and 70s have evolved into a permanent feature of global governance. In fact, both the frequency and scale of mass social mobilizations have more than doubled since the year 2000. These movements are characterized by a shift away from singular leadership toward horizontal networks that prioritize shared values, very Aquarian in their orientation. We see this trend in the local adoption of standards for gender equality, environmental stewardship, and the LGBTQ plus rights, all of which are being increasingly codified into international law following a sustained grassroots pressure. In the field of humanitarian medicine, the gains have been monumental. For example, in 2025, 17 countries completely eliminated one or more diseases, the most ever in 1 year. Trachoma has been eradicated in Egypt, Mauritania, Senegal, Burundi, and Fiji. Also, deaths from tuberculosis and HIV have plunged between 20 and 49% since 2010. Millions of people across the world are escaping extreme poverty. Last year, UNICEF reported 95 million fewer children living in poverty since 2014. And India declared the 60 million strong state of Kerala completely free of extreme poverty. One reason for this is that the world is experiencing record levels of wheat, rice, and soybean production. Same for pears and lemons. National school meal programs now serve 466 million children worldwide, up by 80 million since 2020. Also in the same period, 961 million people gained safe drinking water, 1.2 billion gained safe sanitation, 1.5 billion gained access to basic hygiene. Science's redemptive influence in society has also been unprecedented. For example, global concentrations of pollutions of all sorts are falling. The EU has been smashing clean air pledges ahead of schedule, and the average Chinese citizen now lives 2.9 years longer thanks to air quality reforms. In the realm of enlightened legal advancement, laws banning child marriage have proliferated across Asia, Africa, and Latin America over the past year. And female mutilation has fallen by nearly half in Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sierra Leone among girls aged 15 to 19 compared to their mother's generation. World Bank data shows a 25% fall in global homicide rate since the year 2000. In 2025, the US murder rate fell to its lowest level in 70 years. And finally, a kind of lightning rod of significant advancements, all of which show humanity's growing alignment with Aquarian values. A tremendous increase in the availability of electricity through solar energy. In fact, in 2025, renewable energy sources produced more power globally than coal for the first time ever. Since 2015, 50 million more girls have enrolled in school, a concerted effort to break back endangered species such as turtles, salmon, bluefin tuna, cranes, storks, and many, many others. Global deforestation has been declining for the last 30 years, and forest restoration is on the rise. Between 2010 and 2020, the world added an average of 20 to 30 new national parks per year, and protected land across the globe increased to over 17% in 2025. Finally, 2025 also saw swimmers in the Chicago River and Paris's Seine for the first time in a century due to a massive multi-billion-dollar government infrastructure project. So, why are these diverse global advances hallmarks of a successful preparation for the externalization of the hierarchy? Because every sector of human activity, from the breakthroughs of modern science and medicine, and the visions of esoteric artists, to the shifts in social justice and spiritual practices, is being vitalized by the new group of world servers. They are involved in all these movements, often initiating these movements and bringing them into full-blown outer activity. Their dedicated efforts are effectively fulfilling the prerequisites for the externalization of the hierarchy by raising the vibratory rate of humanity and grounding the planetary antakarana. The planetary throat center, humanity, is, through the work of the new group of world servers, responding to the planetary heart center, hierarchy. You know, we have to remember that all these gains are just the outer garment, the form aspect, a way of revealing the fact that hundreds of millions of people are consistently, intelligently, and effectively pouring their will and their love into humanity. Okay, I'd like to close with a passage from Externalization of the Hierarchy. A Christ who is present and living, who is known to those who follow him, who is a strong and able executive and not a sweet and sentimental sufferer, who has never left us, but who has worked for 2,000 years through the medium of his disciples, the inspired men and women of all faiths, all religions, and all religious persuasions, who has no use for fanaticism or hysterical devotion, but who loves all men persistently, intelligently, and optimistically, who sees divinity in them and all, and who comprehends the techniques of the evolutionary development of the human consciousness. These ideas the intelligent public can and will accept. They will prepare and work for conditions in the world in which Christ can move freely among men, in bodily presence. He need not then remain in his present retreat in Central Asia. They can and will accept with ease the unity of all faiths when the relationship of the Buddha and the Christ is correctly presented. Then the picture of a Christ demanding a unique position to the exclusion of all other sons of God will fade out in the wonder of the true apostolic succession, in which many sons of God on different rays of differing nationalities and with varying missions are to be seen historically leading humanity along the path of divine unfoldment and nearer to God, the source. Okay, thank you very much. Love to you all.